Did Blake have any announcements? Nope. Okay. Welcome. I see a few people still popping in. But I think I'll go ahead. Long ago, when I was in high school, my friends and I were very interested in Asian martial arts. We were under the influence of Bruce Lee. That was his heyday. And one of us, I don't remember who it was, came upon this verse in the ancient Chinese mystical poem. It's coming through backwards, isn't it? The Tao Te Ching. So I'm going to read it to you. It's very short. Speaking of the enlightened sage, the verse goes, "He walks without making footprints in this world. Going about, he does not fear the rhinoceros or tiger. Entering a battlefield, he does not fear sharp weapons. For in him the rhino can find no place to pitch its horn, the tiger no place to fix its claw, the soldier no place to thrust his blade." So we thought that was some great badass ninja stuff, but we didn't have a clue what it meant. So what does it mean? Let's see if we can follow a trail and elucidate that. So I'm going to bring you forward a little bit. You're probably all familiar with the Japanese poetry form called haiku, but you may not be familiar with the Japanese poetry form called senryu. It's similar to haiku in that it's very short verse and it has a specific syllable pattern that it's supposed to follow, but the theme is different. So haiku is typically, the theme is nature, but with senryu, the theme is humanity. And it's often humorous, ironic. Sometimes it's a parody of well-known stories, older stories from Japan and China. So I'm going to read you this. And it goes, oops, wrong page. Pardon me. The English translation goes like this. The bride is so soft, the mother-in-law can't get her teeth into her. So Japanese mother-in-laws have a bad reputation for bullying the daughter-in-law. And I think that senryu is probably a parody of the verse I read from the Tao Te Ching. But in any event, it brings us a little bit closer to humanity, right? And away from rhinos and tigers and into threats that we're more likely to face. And yet, the bride is impervious. So it says that she's so soft that the mother-in-law has no place to sink her teeth. The word that R.H. Blythe is the translator, and the word that he translates as soft also means nimble and flexible. So nimble and flexible and soft has something to do with being impervious to the bite. But I think we have another clue. From what I've read, the online dating surveys suggest that spiritual but not religious is the growing trend. So what do we mean by spiritual? It's actually, even though it's a word that's really thrown around a lot, I like it. And I like it because its original meanings, going back into Latin and Greek, includes wind. So a spiritual path can be understood as a path that leads you to become like the wind. So what is the wind like? It's fluid, it's permeable, it's transparent. When it moves, it can be very powerful, and when it's still, it vanishes. It can't be contained. There's nowhere in it for the tiger's claw to sink. When it meets an obstacle, it flows around it effortlessly. So the spiritual path leads us to be unfixated and fluid, permeable, transparent, powerful, but capable of complete stillness. How does that happen? That kind of tells us something about the person who need not fear the rhinoceros, but it doesn't say how you get there. But I have another clue. This is the Diamond Sutra. And there's a passage in here, if I could find it. Actually, it repeats several times. So it says, if a bodhisattva cherishes the idea of an ego entity, a personality, a being, or a separated individuality, he is consequently not a bodhisattva. So it seems that cherishing a separate individuality, a sense of self as a thing, an ego entity, a separate being, is the obstacle to being like the wind. So what does it mean to not cherish a separate individual personality, a self as a thing, permanent, static, fixed? So we weave together from multiple threads this sense of being something, being a separate being with a permanent nature floating around in the world. So what kind of components do we weave together? And how is it that they have the power and the stickiness to appear to us to be a thing, an unchanging element in a world that we know is nothing but change? I made a list. So I'm going to read through some of these things, and I want you to be introspective a little bit and see if, as I read any of these possible components of your separate identity and my separate identity, any bells ring. Your physical appearance, your name, your education or lack of education, the school you went to or didn't go to, your career, that's a big one, or lack of a career, that can be just as big. Your own opinion of your success or failure in any aspect of life. Your own opinion of your strengths and weaknesses, again, in any aspect of life. Your abilities and disabilities, once again, your own evaluation. Your town, your city, your state, your nation. Any attachment there? Any grasping? Any sense of your identity tied into those concepts? Your political party or doctrine. I'm almost afraid to even mention that. Your values and principles. Your emotional traits and tendencies. Your reputation, or what you believe to be your reputation. Sometimes I will imagine what, and I torment my students this way as well, what if everybody you know, your family, your friends, complete strangers, the public at large, believed that you were the greatest possible scoundrel and there was nothing you could do to change it? Would that have an impact on your sense of self, your cherished identity? Could you even live with it? Your group identity, that is, any group that you choose to identify with. And then everyone who isn't in your group. In general, your opinions, judgments of yourself and other people. Your story. Where have you been? What have you done? Your memories, your plans, your fantasies, who you know, who you have known. your ancestors, your children or lack of children. So the list can really go on and on and on, and everybody has different bells ringing as I go through this list. And how much of which are woven into your sense of a separate identity. So what does it mean to not cherish the sense of self that we've woven together with these components? Doesn't mean that you don't have a personality. It means that you're not craving, attached, grasping to those components of your personality. And that if they change, or if they're under attack, or if you lose them, or if they're contradicted, you don't suffer. Now, I know as I went through that list, there were probably some of what Shinzen calls yabbits. So yabbits are, yeah, but that's important. Yeah, but you're not taking this into consideration. Yeah, but you don't really know my situation. Those are the yabbits. And absolutely, many of those components of our sense of self are important. But they're important within a framework. And there are other frameworks. So our spiritual path here is what Shinzen calls science informed, I think is what he said, right? So what is the, putting aside the framework in which those components of our cherished sense of self are important, what's a scientific framework look like? Well, light travels in a vacuum at about 186,000 miles per second. And traveling at that speed over a year, light travels a distance that astronomers call a light year. So you can imagine 186,000 miles per second for a year. That's a light year, and I suggest that that's an inconceivably great distance for all of us. We have no personal yardstick that can relate to that distance. Astronomers now think that the observable universe extends about 13 billion light years in every direction. And within that inconceivably vast universe, which may in fact be only one of several or many multiverses, but that incredibly vast universe contains matter. Our galaxy has somewhere between 1 and 200 billion stars in it. And it appears that planets are very common around the stars that we've been able to observe. So you could probably reasonably estimate 100 billion planets in our galaxy. But there's more, because apparently, as far as we can tell, in the observable universe, there's 1 or 200 billion galaxies. Again, a number of other worlds inconceivable. And then looking in the other direction, all of this manifested world, your surroundings and your own body, at the atomic level, about 99% empty space. So everything that seems solid to you is almost entirely empty space, putting aside quantum fluctuations, which the vibrating space is another matter. So what seems important in the framework in which most of us probably evaluate the components of our sense of self, in the scientific framework, it's infinitesimally small, fundamentally empty, and as ephemeral as a spark in a forest fire. So how can the cherished sense of separate self survive in that framework? There's a couple possibilities. One is that you can dress in black and hang around in coffee shops and impress people with how cavalier you are about the meaninglessness of everything. But then that becomes your cherished identity. So you really haven't gotten anywhere. Or you can do what most people do, which is ignore the frameworks in which the sense of self can't assert its independence and thingness and importance, and spend your life pursuing something off the list that I read as if it was very important. And it seems to be in the framework that you've chosen to limit your attention to. Unfortunately, there's a framework that you can't avoid ultimately, and that is the framework of your own mortality. And as your mortality begins to assert itself, your ability to limit your focus into the framework where those things that you've spent your life doing are very, very important begins to lose its firm boundary. And then what happens? I sometimes imagine that I'm at my own funeral, laying in the coffin, and somehow miraculously I'm still able to watch the world go by, people go by. And I imagine, who would I not forgive at that moment? Who would I not heal if I could? What component of my cherished identity would I grip so hard that I couldn't let it go at that time? It's a pretty short list. Maybe nothing on it. So there's a song by the band Steely Dan. Shinzen's actually been known to sing a Steely Dan song in a Dharma talk, but Not this one, and I'm not going to sing it. So you can relax. The song is Razor Boy. And Steely Dan's lyrics are sometimes cryptic. And so I can't claim to know for sure what these lyrics mean. But I think the Razor Boy is the Grim Reaper with his scythe. And the chorus of the song is, will you still have a song to sing when the Razor Boy comes and takes your fancy things away? Will you still be singing it on that cold and windy day? And to me, that's about what's left on that list of important aspects of your sense of self. What's left on your deathbed? And if it's a song of forgiveness and healing and letting go, why wait to sing it until then? So, pardon me. If we're on the right trail, and the Diamond Sutra is right, and what we're looking for is a way to let go of our clinging, our desperate grasping of this sense of separate self. If that's the key, what do we do? How do we get there? That's why you're here. There's a ancient metaphorical story about the butcher and the ox. And the butcher has an ox to work on. And at the beginning, the ox laying there on the table looks like an ox. But after a while, the butcher's doing his work with his sharp knife, and he's cutting up this ox. And at some point, the ox no longer resembles an ox, and it resembles pieces of meat. And that's a metaphor for the process of observing the way we weave together this sense of self from these parts. Observing the parts until the parts no longer look like a thing called a separate sense of self, but instead are parts. And in the metaphor, the butcher's knife is the methods of mindfulness that you're learning, with which you examine the way yourself and world is put together. And with sufficient scrutiny, sufficient concentration, clarity, and equanimity, you begin to see that your sense of self is composed of see, hear, feel. These components that we've talked about arise as see, hear, feel. And you can observe them as see, hear, feel, and begin to see them the way they relate and the way they connect together. And one of the most important things that holds them together relates to what we were talking about earlier, which is purification. the uh, stored up reactive emotional scar tissue acts as a binding force on these components that weave into our sense of self. And so part of the process of loosening this fabric that we've put together is purification, releasing the binding force of stored up emotions. That helps that release. But the result is that the sense of self comes apart. And that can be disconcerting, disorienting, blissful. But the good news is that the ox is reborn and the sense of self comes back. But it's never the same. Each time it comes apart and comes back together in a way that's a little less convincing, a little less compelling, a little less deadly serious in its consequences. And that's a liberating process. Because as the weave of this fabric of the sense of self becomes looser and more permeable, it begins to flow. It becomes fluid and powerful when it moves and still when it doesn't. Moving around obstacles effortlessly. Uncontainable. Having no place within it where the rhino can place its horn, or the mother-in-law her teeth. And so through this process, with your butcher's knife of mindfulness and the ox of your sense, your cherished sense of separate self that can only exist when it's sheltered from the real framework of the universe that we know and the world of change. This process that you're engaging in is a real spiritual path in the sense of the real ancient meaning of that word, becoming like the wind. Letting go. Becoming so permeable that there's no place for the painful circumstances of the world to land. So that you walk through the world effortlessly. Hard to believe, but it's actually true. So there's a I'm going to slaughter this word, and I'm glad Shinzen isn't here to hear this. But there's an important manual of Theravada Buddhism called the Visuddhimagga, or something like that. And in it, there's this verse that I like a lot, and it goes like this. Suffering there is, but no one who suffers. Action there is, but no one who acts. Liberation there is, but no one achieves it. A path there is, but no one who follows it. So what is that nonsense all about? It's about there being no separate self to experience suffering as a victim. It's about action that occurs without drivenness. It's a liberation that leaves any sense of a separate self behind. And a path that no cherished, fixated sense of self can walk. So ultimately, what we do here on this spiritual path is become like the wind by seeing through the illusion of the fixed, separate sense of self. And that's how you can survive being infinitesimally small. Because if you're a grain of sand in the ocean, you're only tiny if you limit yourself to being a grain of sand instead of the whole ocean. And so you as an individual, you're only infinitesimally small in this incomparable universe if you insist on being a separate thing in it. That's where alienation comes from. That's where suffering comes from. That's where our unskillful action comes from. And you're here pursuing the antidote. 3,000 years old, at least. And so we've come full circle, back to being the wind, back to being impervious to the rhino's horn. And I think I'll leave you with just a short bit of a song. I'll have to sit up straight. With apologies to Chris Christopherson and Janis Joplin. Freedom's just another word for no thing left to lose.